Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Culshaw. I have the privilege to serve as the Jack B. King University Librarian here at the University of Iowa. And I'd like to welcome you both on behalf of the University Libraries. I also represent the university as a member of the board of the UNESCO Iowa City City of Literature organization. So I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of our organization to the 2021 Iowa City Book Festival. We're so glad to be back. I hope there are some folks out there on Zoom. Sarah and John, do we see some? All right, great. So welcome, whether you're here in Shambaugh Auditorium in Iowa City, or if you're on Zoom, we're really glad to have you here today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our author this afternoon. Today's author is Dr. Laura Gellott. And Laura was a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin for 30 years. She retired a few years back. And her connection to Iowa is Laura was my undergraduate advisor many moons ago. We won't talk about how many moons ago. But when I read Laura's new book about Helen Perry Curtis and this book about a book, not only was it a really enjoyable flashback to me to History 120, which was the first course I think I took with Laura back in the day. And but also I thought we need to have this book as part of the book festival, because one of the things we celebrate in Iowa City is how literature is created. And there's really a remarkable story here about this. And with that, I'm going to turn over to my friend Laura Gellott, and welcome so much to Iowa City. We're glad you're here.
Thank you, and thank you so much, John, for that welcome. And thank you for everything that you did to make this afternoon possible. I've thoroughly enjoyed my couple of days here in Iowa City and getting to meet some of your friends and colleagues. I also want to make a special acknowledgement to the work of Sarah Pinkham, the coordinator of exhibition and engagement here at the Shambaugh Library, for everything she did to bring this about, and to the administrative assistant to the Dean of Libraries, Kelly Taylor, who also helped make arrangements for this weekend. So this talk was billed in the promotional literature for the book festival in words that began, "Can a book read in childhood be the inspiration for a lifetime of teaching and European travel?" And let me just say that the answer to that question is yes. Helen Perry Curtis's Jean and Company Unlimited, published in 1937, the charming account of an American girl's first encounter with Europe, was precisely that book for me. So here we are at a weekend book festival, meeting in a library, and we are all presumably great readers. And so my focus this afternoon is going to be on not one book, but two. First of all, and well, all together, because you can't really separate them, would be the young adult book that Helen Perry Curtis published in 1937, Jean and Company Unlimited, and then the biography of Helen that I published just about a year ago. So we will be speaking about the two of these together. And I would like to begin, and by way of an extended answer to that question, can a book read in childhood end up being so influential in your life? I would like to begin with the opening paragraphs, the first page of my biography of Helen Perry Curtis. I was not yet 10 years old when, standing beside my mother in front of one of the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined the walls at my grandfather's house, my mother pulled a book from the shelf and, handing it to me, said, "Here, you'll like this. It's about a girl who goes to Europe." I didn't just like this book, I fell in love with it. Jean and Company Unlimited by Helen Perry Curtis was just what my mother said. The story of a teenaged girl who, with her mother, sails to Europe aboard a glamorous ocean liner. While Jean's mother travels the continent collecting material on folk costumes for a book she is writing, Jean spends a year at a boarding school run by Dominican nuns in Provence. There she meets girls from across Europe. Jeanette from France, Giovanna from Italy, Jenny from Norway, Janosika from Czechoslovakia, all Jeans. The girls form a club with the business-like name Jean and Company. Jean spends the summer vacation and then a second year traveling with her mother, visiting these new friends in their own countries. Jean and Company sent me on my own journey. The interest in Europe it inspired led me to a PhD in European history, followed by a 30-year college teaching career. And with that came my own trips to Europe, to many of the places visited by Jean. The book became, as I often said, only half facetiously, the only guidebook I ever needed. So from time to time, over the years, I would interrupt some serious research to try and find out more about Helen Perry Curtis. I was always curious about this book. The preface to Jean and Company tells us this book wrote itself. Jean made a journey and her mother just jotted down some of these adventures from time to time and then eventually gathered them together here. But even as a young person, I thought, who really were these people who could afford to go to Europe in the 1930s, as I correctly intuited, for 2 years and have a trip like this? How much really is true? I would from time to time look things up in the card catalog or the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature with little to no result. And then fast forwarding through the years to the age of Google, even that was not yielding me answers until one night in January of 2015, a random Google search paid off and led me through a series of emails and connections to Helen Perry Curtis's 3 granddaughters. And that connection led to an invitation to visit them for the first of what turned out to be several trips over the next 5 years, culminating last fall in the publication of Helen Perry Curtis and the European Trip of a Lifetime. This book is 3 things, I think. It functions on 3 levels. It is first and foremost a biography of Helen with, as the title suggests, a focus on her European travel. 8 trips over the course of 3 decades. It is the story then of the real life travels behind Jean and Company Unlimited, the book that so enchanted me as a young girl. And it is also in some small part the story of the search for Helen and the origins of that important book. So I'd like to begin by giving us something of an overview of Helen's life. We have her dates here, 1888 to 1980. So she lived a good long life, 92 years. A couple pictures of her at age 2 and at age 20. Helen was born, as it turns out, not terribly far from you all here in Iowa. She was born and raised in Crete, Nebraska. And her grandfather and father were connected with Doan College there in Crete. So Helen was literally raised on a college campus. Thomas Doan, shown here in the picture, is in fact Helen's grandfather. And he is the founder not only of Doan College, but also of the town of Crete. Helen's grandfather, Thomas Doan, was an engineer, and he was employed by the Burlington and Missouri Railroad, which was incorporated in Burlington, Iowa in 1852. And it struck me yesterday afternoon when I first got into Iowa City that one of my first reference points as I began to navigate from hotel to campus was Burlington Street. And I thought, okay, we're in safe territory here. The railroad was incorporated, as I said, in 1852, but Thomas Doan came in 1870 to take the railroad on its next stage from the Iowa-Nebraska border and to push it across the state of Nebraska. And along the way, he founded a series of towns which are still known as the alphabet towns. Towns like Asylum, Berks, Crete, Dorchester, Exeter, and so forth, culminating in Kearney, which is as far west as he took the railroad. Thomas Doan took a particular liking to the town of Crete, and let me just comment about this slide. I was not able to bring this into better focus, but if you just take my word for it, that the horizontal string of towns going across here, those are the alphabet towns to which I referred. Doan took a particular liking to the town of Crete, located on the banks of the Big Blue River, and he built himself a farmstead there and made it both his residence and his working headquarters while he was involved with the extension of the Burlington Railroad. He had a telegraph line connection installed there so that he could direct the work. Not only did he found the towns, but he also, we'll go back to this, established important institutions, particularly in Crete. He was a founder of the First Nebraska State Bank and a founder of the First Congregational Church, and then in particular of Doan College, founded in the Congregational religious tradition. His generosity to Doan College during his life and in his estate earned him what today we would refer to as the naming rights to the college. Thomas Doan, I've referred to him as an engineer, but one of the great regrets in his life is that he had never attended college. I think a lot of us are familiar with the concept of lawyers in the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln comes to mind, who became lawyers by reading law in the office of a barrister. Thomas Doan, who came from Boston originally, did the same thing. Today we'd call it interning with an engineer and studying engineering texts and working in the field with a civil engineer. But he always regretted that he had never had the opportunity to go to college. And as I write in my book, so he founded one instead. And in 1895, he achieved this lifelong ambition to get a college degree. And I write, in 1895, Thomas Doan fulfilled a lifelong wish, earning a college degree. Doan College intended to confer an honorary Master of Science degree, but Doan insisted on writing a thesis and defending it before a panel of faculty members. The class of 1895 photo, shown here, shows Doan, snowy beard contrasting with the black cap and gown, seated in the midst of students, 50 years his junior. And as a lifelong educator, I just find that so moving that this meant so much to him. Thomas Doan left the college in very good hands. In 1872, in fact, at the very founding of the college, he hired a young, newly ordained congregational minister and graduate of Yale Divinity School by the name of David Brainerd Perry to come west and take the reins of this fledgling college. That was 1872. And 4 years later, Brainerd, as he was always called, Brainerd Perry, married Thomas Doan's daughter, Helen Doan Perry. So these are the parents of our Helen Perry Curtis. We'll call her our Helen Perry Curtis now. So Brainerd and Helen Perry. And Brainerd Perry would be president of Doan College for 40 years, from 1872 until his death in 1912. His wife Helen assumed the role of First Lady of the college. She was referred to that way. She presided over a range of activities which would be familiar to many college administrators today, fundraising events, luncheons for faculty, teas for faculty wives, events for women faculty, because Doan at its origins and throughout educated men and women on equal standing and had really a remarkable number of women on its faculty. I spend this kind of time here in our limited time this afternoon speaking about this background of Helen Perry Curtis because I think it's very significant. It's formative of the person she became. She grew up on a college campus. She grew up in a setting where men and women were treated equally, students and faculty alike. She absorbed from her grandfather and from her parents a strong sense of civic responsibility. And growing up in a college milieu, she had a sense of the wider world. One of the things that her grandfather, Thomas Doan, liked to say is, "We are trying to reproduce New England in Nebraska." And leaving aside for a moment any overtones of colonialism or cultural superiority that might carry, he believed that he was doing a good thing in bringing the tradition of New England colleges, New England learning to really the frontier, the prairie. But if Thomas Doan's task or self-appointed responsibility was bringing New England to Nebraska, Helen, in the course of her lifetime, would reverse that. Helen graduated in 1911 from Doan College as class valedictorian, by the way. But then she went on to Columbia University, specifically to a program housed within Teachers College at Columbia, the Decorative Arts program. And there she earned a second bachelor's degree. And as I describe her in more than one place in the book, her personality really was one that combined a Nebraska frontier sense of egalitarianism with a New York sophistication and a very outgoing personality. One of the things to the topic of the Nebraska egalitarianism that I cite very late in the book, Helen, into her 80s, continued to run an interior decorating business that she and her husband founded in the early 1920s. And at one point here in the would have been the 1970s, when Helen, still working as a decorator, called upon one of her well-to-do clients. And along with Helen was Morris, her upholsterer. And the woman met the two of them at the front door and directed Morris to go around to the servants' entrance at the back, whereupon Helen turned and went around through the servants' entrance with Morris. And from that point on, the client never again enforced that kind of distinction. So that frontier egalitarianism. Helen parlayed that degree from Columbia, the Decorative Arts degree, into, first of all, an appointment at the Newark Museum in 1914. And then 2 years later, on the strength of the civil service exam in New Jersey, she was appointed as the director of the State Museum of New Jersey. And let's just pause upon that fact for a moment. A woman in 1916 is director of the State Museum. Now, in fairness, the State Museum, housed then within the state capitol building in Trenton, was a much smaller and less prestigious institution than Newark, but still. And the Newark Museum, shown here on the left of the screen, had its origins within the Newark Public Library. For the eagle-eyed among you, you see Public Library here as the identifying line. But it was interesting that this morning when John was giving us a tour of the campus, he mentioned the synergy between libraries and museums. And you even had an acronym, John. Let's see if I can remember. GLAM. Galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. Okay, this relates to Helens Life. The director of the Newark Museum and then, I'm sorry, the Newark Public Library and then Newark Museum was John Cotton Dana, one of the most famous names in the history of libraries and museums in the United States. And I'll speak in a moment on another slide about the reason for that fame. But these are the places where Helen began her career, first as a museum curator and then as museum director. At Newark in 1916, the Newark Museum mounted an exhibit called the Homelands Exhibit. I treat extensively with this in chapter 5 of my book. And this was an exhibit meant to celebrate the contribution of immigrants in New Jersey. And doing that by bringing forward many of the arts and crafts, examples of the folklore, the cooking, all sorts of customs of the diverse immigrant population there in the East. And Helen was given the special task of helping to develop this. And what she did was to go into the public and parochial schools in Newark, speak to groups of children, encourage them to invite their mothers to come back to the school in the evenings. And then she would speak with the mothers and convince them that, no, some of those things you have at home in trunks, things that you think are old fashioned and not American, please bring those to me. We'd like to showcase these and celebrate them. And throughout the summer then of 1916, this special exhibit was held. And Helen then replicated this kind of exhibit on a smaller scale when she went to the State Museum in Trenton. And so this is one of the through lines in Helen's life, this interest in immigrant or folk culture. She would first have been exposed to it in Crete, which is home to a sizable Czech community. What I have not talked about in detail here today, but I do in chapter 2 of my book, is a year that Helen spent, a kind of gap year, 1908, 1909, living in Summit, New Jersey with a well-to-do uncle and aunt. And during that entire year, she volunteered at a settlement house. And I think probably most of you here in the audience are familiar with that notion introduced by Jane Addams in Chicago of a house in an immigrant or working class neighborhood that served the needs of the poor, the immigrants. So Helen was exposed further to New Jersey immigrants at the settlement house. She carried that, as we have seen, into her work with museums. And later on, excuse me, later on would continue writing about this in her freelance writing, and it becomes, as we've seen and will remind us again, a plot element in Gene and Company Unlimited. And I just also included here a few slides of exhibits from the Homelands exhibit at Newark, things that Helen encouraged women to donate. Let's also just note for a second here, the fact that this is an exhibit that is focusing on things that are the product of women, things made by women, textiles and embroidery and so forth. What Dana was so famous for, John Cotton Dana, the director of the Newark Museum, is the notion of community engagement, what today we call community engagement. He did not want museums to be just storehouses of European old masters. He wanted them to present a vibrant, living American culture and to throw the doors open to the populace from rich to poor, including immigrant. And a special focus also on bringing groups of school children in. And so Helen was part of that development at Newark and again replicated that in her time, 1916 to 1920, as director of the State Museum in Trenton. First European trips, Helen's first 2 of 8, footnote 9, but really 8 trips to Europe. The first 2 were in 1914, when she, with her mother, Helen Doan Perry, went to Europe in June of 1914. And those of you who are quick on the draw with your European history will recall that it was at the end of June 1914 that the Austrian Archduke was assassinated, and within a month, Europe was plunged into war. And I write in detail in chapter 4 of my book about the experience of those 2 women in Europe, trapped literally in Paris and making their way eventually to still neutral Italy. And it was nearly a year before they came home. In 1918, Helen returned to Europe of her own volition as a volunteer with the YMCA, one of 1,500 American women who went to work in France in a canteen, serving the enlisted men and draftees in the First World War. The picture on the left is Helen and her mother in Turin, Italy, in by then early 1915. And then the picture on the right, Helen in her YMCA uniform. I deal with the whole YMCA experience in chapter 6 of my book. Helen returned home from the war I'll just quickly say that at the very end of 1918, she was one of a small group of women sent up to the front lines of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, basically to keep cauldrons of hot chocolate going, to be ferried up to the men in the trenches in those brutal, rainy, chill October days of late October, early November, as the war came to an end. And then she spent several months in the occupied Rhineland in Germany, again, setting up YMCA canteens for the American Occupation Army. But returning home in 1920, she married John Curtis, someone she had met in her arts program at Columbia. They were both students in the decorative arts program. So a picture of the two of them on their honeymoon, and then a contemporary picture of Helen from the early 1920s. Motherhood quickly followed. Helen gave birth to her first daughter, Jean, in 1921, and second daughter, Polly, her name being blocked a little bit by the window there, but Polly, the second daughter, in 1922. You can see the two girls sitting there in that armchair, a chair that is still in possession of two of the granddaughters. I've sat in that chair. Marriage and motherhood brought about a career reinvention for Helen because, again, as I think most of you know, at that time, marriage and certainly motherhood spelled the end of a professional career, certainly one rooted in the civil service, as the museum work was. And so it was at this point that Helen and her husband pursued this interior decorating business based in Summit, New Jersey, serving clients in the greater New York area and some of those upscale, we would say today, suburbs in New Jersey. And she also became a freelance magazine writer, just wealth of women's magazines in particular in those decades. And over the course of the 1920s to early 1930s, she published over 70 magazine articles. Many of them, as I said, in women's magazines. And she drew from her own life. Here we have a decorator lives in a Victorian house, the Summit, New Jersey home of Mr. John Morrison Curtis by Mrs. Helen Perry Curtis, showing their living room. She was a talented seamstress, and she designed and published in women's magazines many drawn to scale patterns for clothes, for children and for women. And you can see that they often with a lot of embroidery, kind of inspired by European immigrant folk costumes or designs. In fact, John Cotton Dana at Newark loaned Helen some of the permanent exhibits that they had kept from the Homelands exhibit so that she could use them as patterns for her magazine work. So this brings us then to 1932, or chapter 8 of my book. 1932, the Great Depression has taken hold of the United States, and if anything, is deepening. The interior decorating business that John and Helen are running in Summit is not doing well. Even their well-to-do clients can no longer afford to decorate their homes or redecorate as they could have before. And in this situation, Helen convinces her husband that she could take the girls, Jean and Polly, shown here in their passport photo, take them to Europe for a year, live more cheaply in Europe with her daughters than they could at home. They'd rent out their house in Summit, and John could live with friends, keep the business going as best he could. But in Europe, she could pursue her freelance magazine writing career and find all kinds of new subjects in this European setting to write about. And this she does. So in the early autumn of 1932, she takes Jean and Polly to Europe and writes lots of articles about European gardens, European homes, European fashion. But in the course of that begins the first of several stories, 11 in all, ultimately, in the American Girl magazine, which at that time was the magazine of the Girl Scouts, not the Pleasant Rowland dolls, American Girl stories of today, but the Girl Scout magazine. The magazine was so happy with her initial offering that they said, please do more of these. And so what she did by combining her two daughters into one girl, for sake of the story, she wrote about their adventures in Provence, in Venice, in Salzburg, but she also drew upon her earlier trip to England with her own mother And then as she continued writing these over the course of the mid-1930s, drew upon subsequent trips back to Europe with her daughters. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. Initially, she was calling her American girl Sue. And so A Day with Suzanne is then Sue and a French girl, Suzanne, spending time together. Eventually, and for reasons we needn't go into here, she changes the name to Jean, but there we are. So ultimately then, gathered together, these 11 magazine stories with another 5 chapters, including a beginning and concluding chapter to pull it all together, lightly edited, become Jean and Company Unlimited. And for the framework narrative, as we learned to call it in English class, Helen develops this fictive spine of a club of girls all sharing the cognates of the name Jean, and that becomes a way in which she can then stitch together these diverse stories that she had written over several years of an American girl in Venice, an American girl in Salzburg, and put them all together into one coherent narrative. And I'll just say the name Jean worked better for that purpose than the name Sue. She could come up with cognates of Jean across the languages. In January of 1938, Jean and Company was named the Junior Literary Guild Selection of the Month, which was significant because that guaranteed library sales. Public libraries across the country had standing orders for not only the Literary Guild selections, which I think many of us remember, but also the Junior Literary Guild. And the first 10,000 copies of Jean and Company Unlimited basically were bought up by libraries, public libraries across the country. My mother somehow managed to be one of the lucky girls who got a copy of Jean and Company for Christmas in 1937. As I've said, 8 European trips in all. We've talked about the 1914 and 1918. Helen went back to Europe twice with her husband in 1926 and 30. These were essentially buying trips for the business, the decorating business and antiques business. We've talked about taking Jean and Polly in 1932 and 33. And then the next 3 trips, we see yet another career reinvention for Helen. She is now acting as a tour guide, representing 2 different tour companies over the course of these 3 years, billing herself as a mature woman guide, her words, who can take your high school or college age daughter on her grand tour of Europe. And if she attracted enough participants for these tours, as she did, she got 2 free tickets, allowing her to take Jean and Polly back with her. And again, all of this feeds into the creation ultimately of Jean and Company. There is one time and one time only after World War II intervenes and breaks the possibility of travel, one trip only in 1970. And I talk about that in the book towards the very end. And there's a kind of melancholy tone to it because the Europe she so knew and loved, the Europe of the interwar years, is gone. What I would like to do now for a few minutes is read some selections from the book. Catch myself up here on my notes. Okay, so one of the things I talked about in the outset is that this is not only a biography of Helen, and I've given you something of an overview of that life story, but it's also a story of the real life trips behind Jean and Company. And so I would like to read you a passage that shows how Helen drew upon her letters home to her mother. She was a very faithful correspondent with her mother, and how the descriptions in those letters, which I was privileged to see, thanks to a family that, as Martha, Pat, and Susie say, never threw anything away, still haven't thrown anything away. All of these letters home from 1918, World War I, 1932-33, the first trip with Jean and Polly, all of those have been preserved. So let's think back to what we originally saw a few minutes ago as the pages of A Day with Suzanne, as it first appeared in American Girl. This becomes the chapter Old Provence in Jean and Company, where the girls are now Jean and Jeanette. So, descriptions of Jeanette's house walk right off the pages of Helen's letters. Helen described, in letters home, a house that she visited. Great cypresses, avenues of old sycamores, flagstone paths running between beautiful flower beds, one garden after another laid out in terraces, and such views. The lovely valley with mountains on either side, the shoreline, and the sea beyond. So that's from a letter that Helen wrote home. By comparison, when Jeanette opens the long arched French windows, Jean, quote, looked out on the most enchanting garden with terrace after terrace of lawn and flowers, olive trees and vineyards, and far below in the distance, the blue Mediterranean. Nor does Helen ignore her house at Turlock. And this is the small villa that, thanks to one of Helen's magazine editor connections back in New York, she was able to rent very cheaply there in Provence. In a letter, Helen described seeing the fields below the house being plowed by cream-colored oxen. Now Jean and Jeanette, quote, climb the hill again on foot, stopping a moment to watch a pair of cream-colored oxen plowing in the upper field. Helen described the villa at Turlock as, quote, a funny little intimate home, so nice and mellow with age and being lived in. Jeanette's house in Jean and Company, we are told, has been maintained in its original form. Aside from adding a bathroom or two and a kitchen stove, no changes had been made to it. Like Turlock, the mellow walls of the fictionalized house were finished in rough plaster and whitewashed. The furniture was heavy and carved from wood, and every mantelpiece held lovely pewter candlesticks or bowls with wicks for burning olive oil. How much more thrilling it was to use candles than pushing a button and getting a glare of electric light. And Helen ultimately confesses to her mother that the house she was renting at Turlock lacked electricity. So they too were using candles and wicks floating in bowls of olive oil. Even the servants at the real life Turlock find their way into the fictional accounts. Cecile, Fifi, and Pierre all make appearances as tenants on Jeanette's family estate. And when I say servants, these were a couple of women who came in once or twice a week to assist with the heavy washing, and Pierre to help dig the garden and so forth. Okay, so again, the real life into fiction. I want to now read a selection from later in the book. This is following the publication of Jean and Company. Actually, it is in the lead up to putting the stories together into a book, and the fact that Helen, in doing that project, was working with a woman named Helen Ferris, who was the one-time editor of American Girl, the Girl Scout magazine, and is at this point executive director of the Junior Literary Guild. So this book was kind of being tracked from the beginning to be such a selection. But I think this passage is interesting and holds some important lessons for us today. The Junior Literary Guild had a pronounced agenda. At a time when new standards of child rearing and the popularity of radio threatened the centrality of reading, the Guild provided direction in the choice of reading material for children, along with the assertion that reading was, quote, preparation for citizenship in a democracy. This agenda explains the tone of the last chapter of Jean and Company, Jean Discovers America. It begins as a mirror to the first chapter, where Jean, on the eve of departure, I'll paraphrase, had been worried, is this a good idea to go away? Are her friends going to forget her? Will she find European girls very strange? Now, 2 years later, returning home, she's again beset by misgivings. At home in America, she would probably have to go to stupid dances and the movies, which she hated, learn to play bridge, and do everything that American girls and boys did. But would she ever hear again the singing boats in Venice, or be able to sit quietly in a dim cathedral or dream romantically in a castle tower? Her friends would not understand, of course. She remembered with a little shiver how they had all thought that Rosemary was conceited when she came home after a summer abroad, and could talk of nothing but what she had seen in Europe. That's a passage directly from Jean and Company. But Jean's father provides the resolution. You have had the great advantage, he tells her, of traveling and seeing beautiful things and making friends at the very most impressionable time of your life. You have also learned how to use your eyes and ears as you never used to. Perhaps now you'll know how to use them better in your own country. Promising to show her every day something in America as interesting and beautiful as what she had seen in Europe, Jean's father takes her to St. Patrick's Cathedral, to the cloisters, to a Swedish restaurant, to the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But Jean discovers something else, and now quoting again directly from Jean and Company. The things she was beginning to enjoy most of all were things that she had not seen anywhere else in the world, like the Radio City building, the New York skyline, paintings of snowy New England landscapes, murals of workmen straining at great machines, factory smoke in the sunset light, fields of goldenrod and asters, tall spired country churches. All the other countries had brought their treasures, their talents and personalities, their traits and traditions, and America had absorbed them all. But out of this great melting pot had grown other things that were magnificently American, young and strong and vital, and beautiful too. She would never stop loving European things and would look forward eagerly to returning as often as she could. But now she would begin to use her eyes and ears for discovering America. Well, Jean and Company, as I said, published in November of 1937, designated a Junior Literary Guild Selection of the Month in January of the following year, was widely reviewed, even in small town newspapers at a point in time where even small town papers could employ a book reviewer or an arts critic on staff. I read dozens and dozens of reviews, ranging, as I say, from small towns all the way to the New York Times, which gave it a lengthy and favorable review. And let me segue at this point to the fact that Jean and Company is once again available. In the aftermath of publishing my book, a number of people contacted me and said, I'd really like to be able to read Jean and Company now, but apparently it's out of print. Yes, long out of print. And the revived interest in it started running up the price on Amazon and eBay. I had actually, at the beginning of my research, purchased a backup copy since my mother's copy was becoming rather fragile. I bought it for $8. And then I was starting to hear reports from friends, well, I paid $25. Well, they're asking $50. Well, ultimately it got up to $180 and was, yes, somebody's head just jerked up, and was actually classified as a rare book. So I said to Helen's granddaughters and then to the editor of my book, the granddaughters own the copyright, and why should the eBayers be capitalizing on this? Could we bring out a reprint edition, which just last month we were able to do with a new preface, which I provided, and a foreword by Martha and Pat Wells, Polly's daughters, and Susie Photo, Jean's daughter, so Helen's granddaughters, and this is now available again. At a speaking engagement that I did a couple weeks ago, somebody asked the very good question, why would a young girl, a teenager today, want to read a book written in 1937 about an American girl of that era? And I thought quickly on my feet, something that 30 years of teaching college students does prepare you to do. And actually, in retrospect, I was pretty satisfied with the answer I gave. I said, well, there's something universal about Jean, again, a teenager, forced to be independent for stretches of the book. She is on her own, either at the boarding school, having to make friends, having to learn a new language, having to show that she is capable of growing up and rising to the circumstances. In other chapters of the book, she is traveling on her own from place to place as she meets up again with friends from this club back at school. And then there was a passage in particular that came to my mind that evening, and I'd like to read it again. It's again a passage directly from Jean and Company. And let me again set the stage for this. This is the chapter on Norway, called Norway and the Long Winter Night. And in this one, Jean and her friend Jenny are traveling with Jenny's grandfather up the coast of Norway, broken by fjords, on a mail boat, M-A-I-L boat. And again, the long winter night, where, as we are told in Jean and Company, the sun appeared for only a few moments, an angry red ball rising halfway above the horizon, and then apparently going down in a rage. From Hammerfest, overlooking, quote, the wildly tossing Arctic Ocean, the girls, guided by scouts, ski to the tip of the North Cape. In the final pages of the chapter, Helen provides one of the most moving passages in Jean and Company, one that expresses the author's aspirations for her fictional character and a mother's hopes for Jean and Polly as well. And now quoting from Jean and Company. Surely this was the high point of her trip, Jean thought. This one moment of facing the elements, longing to make of her life something strong and courageous and new. Out of darkness to search for light and find it, to reach into the unknown for knowledge and then give it as a gift to the world. She tried to tell Jenny what she was feeling, but her lips were stiff with the cold and a great wind blew the words back into her throat. She wished her father were standing beside her because he would understand without the need for words. She was very quiet as they climbed down the dim zigzag trail to the little ship whose lights were bobbing in the harbor. She wanted to keep in her heart that moment of exaltation. The rest of Norway did not really matter. And I think in the lives of every young person, every adolescent, there comes some moment where you realize this is what matters to me. This is what I want to do. This is an experience I'm going to carry forward. And I think that makes Jean and Company a book that anyone, any young person or older person could benefit from reading again. There's also a wonderful line from the New York Times 1938 book review in which it refers to Jean, the fictional character Jean, as exhibiting the most important characteristics for a traveler: goodwill and a readiness for experience. And isn't that also the recipe for living a good life? Goodwill and a readiness for experience. Okay. So we've talked now, the biography of Helen Perry Curtis. We've seen something about the real life travels behind Jean and Company Unlimited. And I said this book is also in part the story of the search, the successful search for a significant childhood book. And I just want to read you from almost the very end of the book about Helen's younger daughter, Polly. Polly outlived her mother and sister by many years. It was my great good fortune on the last day of my first visit to New Jersey to meet her. On a glorious summer afternoon, Susie, Martha, Pat, and I piled into the car and drove the short distance down the road to the nursing home. "Wait here," said Martha as we entered the reception area. "I'll go get Mom." Minutes later, Martha came back up the corridor pushing a wheelchair in which sat an erect, smiling, white-haired lady with beautiful blue eyes. I found her, I thought. It's the girl in the book. We sat outside on the sun-drenched patio. "Mom," said Pat, "you remember we told you about Laura. She's interested in the book Gan wrote about your trips to Europe and wants to ask you some questions." "Oh," said Polly, "I don't remember much. It was a long time ago." But the stories poured forth. the name of the ship on which they sailed to Cannes in 1932, how she and Jean explored the boat from top to bottom, the neighbor's dog who visited daily at the villa at Turlock, how Polly and Jean freely roamed Venice, getting rides from a handsome young gondolier while their mother stayed at her desk and wrote. The trips of the later years, Norway, Yugoslavia, Salzburg, and the Elizabeth Duncan School at Schloss Klessheim, where the girls slept in a dormitory room, the dark blue ceiling decked with silver stars and moons, just like Jean, just like in the book. And with her daughters and niece standing behind her, I took a photo of Polly holding the copy of Jean and Company Unlimited that my mother had handed me so many years before. A true full circle moment. And I think that was the moment where I thought, I've got to write a book about this. I've got to, because as I had already seen the wealth of resources that Martha and Pat had in their attic, meeting Polly and this moment as the shutter clicked, I thought, so here we are, a successful search. So that is what I have prepared as formal remarks. This still gives us some time. And I know that John and Sarah here have been monitoring the Zoom presentation. Hello to all of you out there in Zoom land, particularly to Martha, Pat, and Susie, and also some extended Perry family relatives. I should mention, because I kind of slid over it, that 1932-33 trip, Helen, Jean, and Polly were joined for a time by Helen's sister-in-law, Evelyn Perry, who was married to Helen's younger brother. She brought her 4 children along, Phoebe, Henry, Howard, and little 3-year-old Evie. So at one point, there were the 2 American women and their collective 6 children at Turlock, and some of the grandchildren of those, the grandchildren of Evelyn, the children of those 4 are watching today as well. So hello to you. Okay, questions. We have time for some questions.